Hello and welcome to Reed Smith's Labour and Employment Real-Time Chat Series. My name's Alison Heaton and I'm the Knowledge Management Lawyer supporting the UK employment team. And I'm joined today by David Ashmore and Carl de Cicco, partners in the London office. And today we're going to be looking at workplace COVID vaccination policies in England, looking at the latest issues that employers are facing as we start 2022. So let's start by reminding ourselves of the latest position on mandatory vaccination in England. Carl, could you remind us of the position, please?
Yes, so essentially at the present time, it's care home settings and also potentially in future NHS and frontline care services that may have a vaccine mandated for them. Outside of that, no other employers are required to mandate that their workforces are vaccinated. And so whilst it's something that they can take up, it's not something that the government mandate per se.
And are you expecting that to change so that the mandate extends beyond care home and frontline NHS care, social care and health services?
Well, I think the most recent outbreak of Omicron shows that we can't really rule anything out in future. But the present mood music is that we're coming out of a crisis point, and this is obviously end of January 2022. And that the way things are looking, the government is looking to remove any government interventions, so things like restrictions. So with that mood music, I wouldn't expect anything on the mandatory vaccine side of things to change in that regard.
Okay, so does that mean that employers outside the care home and health and social care settings are left to choose what they do about their own employees?
I think that's right, Alison. I think it's up to employers to determine if mandatory vaccination is a route that they want to go down, and if so, they'll need to look at the various legal areas that need to be tackled in order to implement that kind of policy throughout the workforce. Okay,
so interestingly, there was some research at the end of last year that suggested there was an increase in job advertisements requiring vaccination as a condition of employment. Is that something that you've seen outside of the mandated areas? David?
No, not really. I mean, it's something that didn't exist before as an issue. And I think what we're seeing is more job vacancies, partly because of Brexit, partly because of the economy rebounding from COVID. So I don't think it's a surprise that we've seen more. And I'm certainly not seeing a general trend towards requiring that. What we tend to see is it often is a reflection of what the parent company thinks and where the parent company is based. And so a lot of the UK companies that are requiring vaccines and outside of social care, that very special sector, often have US parent companies who are requiring all their US employees to be vaccinated and then requiring it to be applied globally to the extent that they can, subject to local law. And as Carl said, well, actually in the UK, there's nothing that stops an employer. Well, we'll go on to discuss this in more detail, but there's no piece of law that says you cannot do that. There are a lot of legal issues to think about.
And are you seeing the same thing, Carl?
Yeah, that's broadly my experience as well. The two areas where I am seeing mandatory vaccination arrangements being rolled out are in settings where people have a close relationship with their customers and often on client site or meeting customers in other venues, and also in settings where workforces are working closely together. So, for example, on the shop floor, in a laboratory, those kind of environments where people are looking to provide that extra bit of protection and surety.
Yeah, and are you finding that employers are wanting to require full vaccination for their existing workforce as well as new recruits, or are they limiting their requirements to new starters? Carl?
My experience has been that they've tried to apply it across the board, or they seek to apply it across the board. I think from an employment law perspective, you would say, look, let's stick to the new joiners because, in terms of the legal web of obligation you have to try and navigate, there are fewer obstacles there. So, for example, they'll already have a contract of employment in place. And so if you're looking to put a contractual provision in about vaccination for an existing employee, that's a change. If you're looking at a workforce that's mature in their service, people who've run you in 51 weeks, trying to implement a mandatory vaccination policy could lead you down the unfair dismissal route. Whereas for new joiners, you're really just looking at the potential discrimination risk on recruitment, and also making sure you've navigated appropriately all the data protection requirements that sit alongside and are just as important, if not more so, the employment piece here.
Are you seeing the same thing, David?
Yeah, same thing. So trying to achieve the same end result, but having to be a lot more careful and subtle in the messaging for existing employees.
Yeah.
Because obviously with a new hire, you can just tell them, if you want the job, you've got to have a vaccine. If you want, we'll come on to the legalities of that, but that is an option.
So you mentioned, Carl, about discrimination risks and also risks around introducing changes to a contract. Would you like to explain that in a bit more detail, Carl, about the issues that employers need to bear in mind if they're looking to implement policies of this nature?
Yeah, absolutely. So if an employee already has a contract of employment, then coming to that employee and saying to them, look, we want to ensure that all of our employees are vaccinated. I'm going to make that a contractual requirement, not just a policy change. You're essentially looking for a form of employee consent in order for that particular amendment to become valid. And if that consent's not forthcoming, whether it's for a good reason or none, that puts you in a position where you've got to decide whether you're going to push ahead with that contractual change. And if you don't, and that's one thing. If you do, you're in dismissal territory, which could potentially be an individual matter, or if you're talking about 20 or more employees, you could even be in a potential collective consultation scenario, which is possibly somewhere you really don't want to be if you've got a large workforce. And as I was saying earlier, if that workforce itself is also got sufficient amounts of service, as a sort of general rule, people have got 1 year and 51 weeks and can therefore claim unfair dismissal if dismissed. You'll have to ensure that before you've gone to the step of trying to put a change in place of this nature, which could lead to a dismissal, that you have a very clear objective as to why you're doing it, and that it makes sense for what you're doing in your industry and the workforce you've got and its makeup, that you've got a clear policy, and that you're looking very carefully about how you implement it before you proceed, because you could find that you inadvertently trigger unfair dismissal claims, or worse still, if you have a sort of a caucus of employees who wish to pursue things more aggressively, they may even seek the constructive dismissal, unfair dismissal route. There are also discrimination risks to consider too, but I'm conscious that I've sort of hogged this sort of section, so perhaps take David's view on the discrimination piece.
No, it's really interesting. So the obvious discrimination risk is around if there's a medical reason why somebody can't get vaccinated. It's actually quite hard to think of a medical, one particular condition, but I think there are people who are immunocompromised, people who are still shielding now, who for whatever reason aren't able medically to have a vaccine. And for those people, the argument would be, well, it's something arising from my medical condition, which is a disability, and therefore the employer needs to objectively justify the requirement. And really what that means is you've got to have a good business reason that's proportionate. And so can you think of another way to get to the same place? Is there some other thing we can do to avoid this requirement? Which is actually quite similar to the unfair dismissal test in a way, doesn't it? What we should be, as an employer, we should be bending over backwards to avoid a situation where we're firing somebody for this requirement. Have we thought about all the reasonable alternatives? Could we go down a testing route, for example, instead of requiring mandatory vaccination? Surely if somebody can test negative every day, the argument would go, why do you require them to be vaccinated? So the obvious one is disability. The more subtle one, I think, is religion or philosophical belief. There are certain religions that part of their creed is not taking any form of, I was going to say, blood products or vaccines. And that would be an obvious basis for them to claim this is some kind of less favorable treatment based on their religion, but it's the same test about effective justification. Because it would never be, we're firing you because of your religion. It would always be something that places somebody at a disadvantage indirectly. So it would be indirect discrimination and therefore capable of objective justification. Have you got a good business reason that isn't discriminatory, that's proportionate? Have you thought about other ways of getting to the same place?
Yeah, thank you. And aside from contractual issues and discrimination, is there anything else that employers need to take into consideration? I'm thinking particularly around data. David?
Yeah, there's been a lot in the press around the really thorny issue of checking vaccine status and or even COVID tests, and whether you end up running what is effectively a health database. Now, the purpose of today is not to get into the detail on that, but there is some helpful guidance. The short version is there's some helpful guidance on the ICO website that suggests if you're not taking any record of someone's vaccine status, you wouldn't be processing personal data, and therefore you don't need to worry about GDPR. Now, query actually how that works in practice. How, as an employer, you can meaningfully check something without having any record of it. And then the other thing that's clear is if you do keep a record of it, written or email, or you're scanning a QR code, then you are into the world of GDPR, data protection regulation, and we're talking about health data. So it is super regulated, extremely difficult, and not a place that you would want to be, and certainly something you would need to take specialist data protection advice on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the other thing I wanted to move on to was something else that's received a lot of media attention, certainly in recent weeks, and it's this idea that some large organisations in this country have started to introduce a change to their sick pay policy, in that they are declining company sick pay to unvaccinated workers who have had close contact with a positive case and are required to self-isolate as a result, and presumably can't work because there's an inability to work from home. And that's received lots of press attention of late. I'd be interested to hear your views on a policy of that nature, and whether you're seeing clients asking for advice on implementing something similar. Carl?
Yeah, it's a super interesting area. A point to be clear on, just as you mentioned, is that it's not the complete removal of sick pay altogether. It's two very clear things. The first is that if you are required to self-isolate because you've been in close contact of someone with COVID and you are unvaccinated and therefore required to undertake that self-isolation period, you still remain entitled to SSP. It's really just the issue of whether or not you get paid company sick pay on top. And it's also the case that prior to the pandemic, there would not have been an extension of sick pay to cover this kind of scenario. It's something that's been created expressly for the pandemic. So, without getting into the rights and the wrongs of it, it's employers effectively taking away or saying that the benefit we had previously provided to people who are in no position but to self-isolate is now being removed. And so the option for the employee is, okay, well, look, I can either get vaccinated and therefore I will no longer need to self-isolate, or if I am in a position where I still have to self-isolate because I'm a close contact, because of my choice, I will not receive that additional enhanced company sick pay from my employer. So from a legal perspective, it's clear that there may still remain some risks in relation to discrimination, because those people who, for whatever reason, find themselves less able or unable to get a vaccine because of perhaps their belief or perhaps because of a medical condition, they will find themselves in a position where, unless there's an exemption in the policy or some other route through, potentially being disadvantaged and potentially having a claim for that reason.
Thank you, David. Have you got anything to add?
Yeah, just to agree with exactly what Carl said, and to take that one step on, is that's why you often see with these policies a bit of like an escape route, if you like, that it's a really bad idea to have a blanket policy. You should always allow something at the bottom that says, if you've got any concerns about this, or if there's anything you want to discuss, then you should reach out to the HR contact. And then you create an avenue for somebody to say, look, I can't do this because of my religion or belief or my disability. And then at least you can have a closer look at that before you then say, if you want to, no. Again, at least you do it with, knowing that that issue is out there, rather than you put the blanket policy up and somebody resigns straight away, and then you end up with a claim, and you could have potentially avoided that. You might have been able to find a way around it. You may have been able to redeploy somebody for a short period into a different role, or there's loads of options you could have thought about. So that would be my top tip.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's about clear communication and flexibility of an employer, and as you say, not applying a blanket approach, allowing some flexibility if it's needed.
That's right. And just remember, everything you do, everything you say, every communication, if there's going to be a claim, the tone of that is going to be really important. Do you come across as an unreasonable employer, demanding something at short notice with no explanation? Or is it obvious through everything that you said that this is a really serious health and safety type measure that you're introducing really as a last resort, and you're asking employees to cooperate with it? And you see
Absolutely.
these cases.
I'd have thought that point you say about the rationale for introducing the policy in the first place is also going to be really important, and explaining why this is being done. And inevitably with policies of this nature, we're looking at health and safety of workers, but it's whether that can be communicated and clearly explained why this is being introduced. So
the other thing to have in mind is that you need to be able to capture the moment in time at which the policy decision is being made. So at the moment, we feel more relaxed about COVID possibly this week. It feels like we're coming out of Omicron slightly, but and we all know about vaccines. But if you were, imagine you were requiring this in March, April 2020. Or at any time before the vaccines came in. It's just trying to remember what it was at that time, with that state of knowledge about the available options, that led you to have the decision that you've taken today. So, for example, if you will be asked, I'm sure, if somebody's being sued on, well, why did you require someone to have a vaccine? Why didn't you just let them test every day? You're going to have to answer that question by reference to what was the availability of testing, how reliable was the testing, and why you took a view that on the balance of risk, it wasn't appropriate to allow that as an option. And that will change over time. So it all goes, golden rule of anything HR related, I think, keep a contemporaneous record of why you reached the decision that you did, so that you've got it, and you can come back to it in the event that there's some claim in a year's time.
Yeah, and I think it goes one step further than that, David, in that it's not just about whether you can justify your position at a moment in time, but also about keeping it under review, and whether this is a policy that you still need at various points further down the line. And if at any point you can no longer justify the reason for having it, or the rationale for having it in the first place no longer applies, then revisit that policy and change it if needed.
Yeah. Which is really hard with with variants, and that being an important factor as well. And obviously, the more serious the risk to health, the easier it is to justify something.
Yeah.
So but completely agree.
So actually, not unlinked to that was the final point I was going to raise, and it's the idea of what full vaccination means. So we're seeing that where organisations are wanting to introduce policies around vaccination, and indeed the legislation where it's being mandated, there's this idea that workers are fully vaccinated. And the question then is, well, what does full vaccination mean, and whether it should include any booster or not? We've obviously just gone through a period of a booster rollout, which is available to all adults in this country, and whether you think that vaccination policies should require a booster to be had where it's been available in order for somebody to be deemed fully vaccinated. Carl, what do you think?
I think it's linked to a general point in relation to mandatory vaccination, which is that it's quite a heavy policy, quite a heavy requirement. You're asking people to, take a medical intervention, and so in order to justify that, both from an unfair dismissal and discrimination perspective, you need to show there's a whole web of things that are going on at the same time. So, for example, I would expect people to be testing on a regular basis, as well as other requirements to keep safe. And so when a new booster comes on the horizon, which increases protection, you would expect, in order to continue to maintain that justification that everything is so important, you're doing everything that possibly can be done, that taking that booster becomes added to the requirements. In the policies that I have worked on, it tends to be a requirement of that policy that as new boosters, new vaccinations or top-ups become available, that employees avail themselves at the earliest opportunity in order to be compliant with the policy. And so I would expect, if you're undertaking a mandatory vaccination policy, you would expect a booster to be taken sooner rather than later, as and when it becomes available. Obviously, there's a practical perspective here, which is that when things first are rolled out, you're not going to be able to get them just because of supply and demand issues. But there will come a point where that changes policy, and indeed the enforcement of the policy will need to move to reflect that at the appropriate time. That would be my view.
Do you share that view, David?
Yes, absolutely. And it's not easy, because you need some kind of dynamic language that reflects that there are new boosters possibly coming out in the future that we can't even anticipate now. We may need to capture those as well, but also not, and asking people to comply with that without actually knowing what they are or whether they're proven. So I think there is an element of, you just got to keep it under constant review, but also kind of take a reality check as well, which is that actually most people want a vaccine. Most people want to be safe. And if somebody's had one vaccine, it's very likely they'll go on and have another one. And so there is an element of thinking about the balance as well in the communications. And again, getting the tone right. It's nothing more likely to persuade somebody not to do something than telling them they've got to do it. I think it's a particularly British thing. We don't like being told what to do. So there's a psychological side to it as well as all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think time prevents us from exploring these issues any further, but I'm really grateful for your thoughts on those tricky issues. And I imagine, like with everything pandemic related, things will continue to develop as we hopefully now come out of the worst of it. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. In the meantime, feel free to check out our UK Employment Law newsletter for all the latest news and developments in UK employment law. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.